Right now at the off-grid workshop trailer, doing a little modification to the power system. This is a solar array that you're probably accustomed to seeing tilted in the up position out here. And but right now I've got it set for traveling, and I'm going to be switching a lot of stuff around here. And in preparation for that, I decided to go with, instead of simply hardwiring everything through, I'm going with the quick detach cable system, and I believe those are 8-gauge cables. So what I decided to do was go with Anderson power pole connectors. These are available online or cable and battery shops. Not particularly cheap. That was $8.95 for each half of this. Okay, so you're looking at over twice the money compared to, let's say, MC4 connectors. But the thing is, MC4 connectors kind of max out at 10-gauge cable, and when I've gotten all the branch lines down to a main line on that particular setup, I'm using thicker cable. So the way these things are made is they're all the same, but because of the way they click together, it's like you can't connect them wrong, because it's like an upside down, right side up type of arrangement. You can mix and match these. You don't necessarily have to put them on in a pair, but obviously when you start something out, you start it out in a pair. And what I'm having to do is design a extension cord system for the solar array versus the charge controller versus the way everything's going to hook up to the batteries. It's going to be semi-portable. It's something that can be unplugged, replugged, and moved around. And this is what I decided to go with. These are also used a lot in off-road stuff for winches. And they're used with higher powered electrical power tools, like a lot of 220 type stuff. Or higher powered DC stuff. You're usually going to be winches on vehicles. The thing is, they're usually going to use a thicker, heavier duty version of this. And when I deal with quick detach battery cables, they're larger and much more expensive because there's a soldering element involved. So this little video is going to detail how this works on the crimp version. On with another important aspect of this, and hopefully it shows up in the video. These are marked with a polarity, and I'm using color-coded wires, which is going to make the insertion relatively simple. What's less simple and less obvious is the metal tabs and the plastic shelf in there is part of what makes a quick detach system in this work, along with the shapes of these little connectors. You see how that goes? It's kind of a little zigzag type of arrangement. So when you look carefully inside of here, you'll notice there's a metal tab, and that metal tab at the back side kind of hits at an angle. And the way that works is that angle needs to match up with this angle right here. And then if you look carefully at this, and hopefully it shows up in the video here, I'll put that in the shade a little bit, you'll notice there's a little shelf there, almost like a little sear trip area on a firearm trigger or something like that. Well, that's actually the catch. And that catches on the edge of that little metal angle piece that's inside the connector, and that's what's going to hold the wire into the connector with this end on. Now, it's crimped at the barrel side, and this particular one is crimp only. There's others which come with that area filled with solder, and what you do is you heat that up, you sink your wire into the hot wet solder material, and it's soldered in. But the little hook type arrangement is apparently pretty similar across the board. You just got to make sure you get that orientation the same on both of them and get it the right way. My best advice would be that if you're installing these, realize they push in from this end, and take a careful look at it, maybe do a little test fit so that you know you have the orientation right. If you get it wrong on one side, obviously you're going to have a hell of a time getting them apart. If you get it wrong on both sides, I think you pull it out, you stick it in until it clicks. Now, something very specific to solar power applications is, in the electrical world, we talk about hot work. Now, hot work is when you're working on electrical connections that are live. And that means you got to be extremely careful not to touch the wrong stuff at the wrong time or you get zapped. Now, before working on this rig, what I did is I came out here just as it was getting dark and the panel was not producing power, and I pulled the fuse on this stereo fuse block that I used before it gets into the charge controller. And when I pull that fuse, I'm basically turning the panels off from here. But here's the thing, whenever the sun's out, the panels are on. Now, right now, they're not connected up to anything, but there's 30 amps of potential amperage happening there, only a little distance apart. So if those things were to touch, okay, we're welding, all right? And as I handle this thing, we're welding. So I hope you don't mind if I set the iPad camera down and do this very carefully while I sweat this out and make absolutely certain I've got the orientation right. Now, as far as the receiving end goes, we're a little bit less critical because I did remove the fuse. So hopefully this focuses, and what you may or may not see inside of there is we stick that in until it clicks, and as I place two of these up against each other, what it is those tabs grab on each other and then push the connectors in, so they're a little bit spring loaded. That's basically how this thing works. And to pull it apart, you just pull it apart. But so the scary part's done. This is a part that's always live. Now, one of the advantages I have is I can now handle this thing and plug and unplug it, and it's impossible to be touching both sides of that with bare skin or bumping up against metal or something like that. Not exactly waterproof, but then the way we would crimp a connection like this, I don't think that's going to be a problem. This is an outdoor use application. But if we're going long term on something like this, we want to go through some trouble to make sure that this is relatively undercover and going to be able to dry. About this being a relatively short wire run right here is I wanted to make sure I got the orientation on these really right, really close together. Now here, as a safety precaution, when I cut these two wires, I cut them offset to each other. That way, when the cutting tool is on one, it's not arcing across the other. Here, that's not really an issue because I removed a fuse, but I had to retrim that so that these both end up at roughly the same length, and that when I click the connector in, our orientation is such that it's going to connect to this while it's up here. Something like this, sometimes you'll hear the audible click when you click those in, and sometimes not. But once they're in, it's, oh, it wanted to come undone. One of the issues I run into, a regular electrician's wire crimper isn't going to get you enough pressure to do these super tight, so I'm using vice grips. Now, there is larger wire crimpers that almost look like they use the same leverage system as a bolt cutter. They pinch around, so there's a little part of the wire that spreads on the inside. That's what I'd rather use on this, and it's one of the reasons why the larger sizes are a solder in. But we do this, we have to make sure things are secure, because it's going to be made to be jostled around a little bit. But if it's not being jostled around, you're okay. But I had to retighten those, and we'll click those in and get everything going. It's plugged in. What I'm not a big fan of is the way these things don't really click when you plug the plastic together. It's just kind of a press fit, so sometimes you got to keep an eye on that, make sure it stayed together, or give it a wrap of tape. But the idea is that attaching and detaching this is supposed to be a lot faster than, let's say, undoing screws and nuts. It also allows us to set a cable up that, would go through. I don't have to make this hole big enough to get all the other attachments through it. Go. Now I can still quickly detach power here, but I've changed my cabling over to a quick disconnect section, at least on the outside, so that the array can be taken down and set up a little differently. I'm going to say this. I'm going to be looking for some better cable and plug type stuff, because I want to make this detachable, and then the other end of the wire runs eventually detachable, so that everything remains compatible with this. semi-mobile portable inverter system. A follow-up on this connector that I've done to attach a solar array to, of course, my inverter and everything inside, is previously this had just been a straight wire run. It really had not given me any trouble. The main thing I wanted to do, though, is make it where I could remove this array a little bit faster and easier and set it up on the ground, and then, of course, return this trailer to cargo duty. So I installed this. You'll see this in the beginning of the video. It was highly recommended to me by the people at the battery shop, electrical shop, as opposed to repurposing high amperage connectors that were made for AC power. So I crimped it because the instructions said it was crimping attachment. What I may end up doing is taking some of this back apart and then soldering it, because what's happening is this is very hot to the touch. Yeah, it's pushed together, everything's right, but it's very hot to the touch. Now, the place sold spares on these plastic covers, so apparently they know that these things can, develop a lot of heat and possibly fail. And this is not hot weather, and that thing's very, very hot to the touch. It's almost like you could cook on that thing, and that's something I'm not liking. And so I'm going to maybe use some more of these connectors, and if it burns, I don't think it feeds back any problem into the rest of my system. But I'm definitely going to be looking for something better, something that's more secure than this type of connection. And of course, cigarette lighter connections are definitely not good for much of this at all. And the MC4 connectors are okay when we've turned all of our watts into more watts at higher voltage, but when we start running a lot of amperage through the connectors, it needs to be a big, thick, heavy connector, and doing that as a quick detach apparently leads to some issues, because this is only 30 amps, well within the rating for the cable and everything else involved. But this thing's hot enough to the touch, and I think when I come back in the future, that might be a little bit melted. So after no love or forgiveness at the battery place where I bought these, there's no instructions that come with this, okay? Apparently I had put something together wrong. And I'm going to leave it in the video because, I don't consider it all my fault, because it was, no instructions of this stuff. So when this connector overheated, one of the things, when those click in place, they'll click in place entirely upside down. And so if you have any looseness when you've clicked it in, that's probably because it clicked in upside down. What happens is, these little connectors, if you can see carefully, there's a little hook type assembly on there. The round, semi-rounded part doesn't really go up against the metal. It has to go up against the other connector, and a little hook has to be around the other side of it. So the little notch, the one that looks like a little trigger notch on a sear of some sort, has to move all the way forward and click on, gee whiz, I hope that shows in the video. It has to click on these things, and it has to be in there pretty deep to do it, in order for everything to be tight. There's nothing back here. There's no little screw down, clamp down type thing. Everything goes on that little spring-loaded connector there, is what holds it together. I can't say I'm a big fan of this, but there's really nothing better out there. And I'm not saying I'm a lover of quick cable connector brand. I'm saying that nobody's come up with anything that's superior to this, and obviously I think there's room in the market for something to be better than this, because there should be something better than this. Anyway, I'm going to show a little bit more. This is also my Gorilla Glue drying, so that I have another connector here. There's some other videos that are detailing this solar generator build, but I'm going to include everything, the shitty parts and the good parts, in the quick cable connector part. We're crimping this in because I had to shorten this quite a bit to get the defective one off. Obviously it's much more sensitive to getting these in the right direction. If you have a barrel type crimper, you're going to do a little better, but there's room in this that it's still going to fit all that stuff. And if you click these in and they don't feel like they went pretty darn tight, then if you click these in, they don't feel like they went pretty darn tight, something probably is wrong. So what I'm going to do is, you can kind of see the orientation on this. This is how these are supposed to click in. Now, I want to make sure there's no other movement here. And then we click these in. Now I'm going to have to set the camera down to do that. That clicked in as far as it needs to go, these little ends are going to all the way show. So hopefully you've watched the video all the way through. You got to see the wrong way, then the right way. I'm going to leave them both in the video because you need to understand how these work. And I'll put a note in the comments section on where to move forward to make sure that we're getting it right. Because that's where our little hooks are, that what's going to hold that together correctly. Now, the other thing, of course, is the part that I hate, which is electrical hot work. The sun's out on the panel, so this dealing with this stuff is going to be very, very sensitive because I've got a full 30 amps of power running through this. I'm not going to do it with the camera in one hand and the crimpers in the other. To figure out every single wrong way to orient this, I had to flip this around so that my color code works standardized with the positive negative, the way these things go. When I install the red first with the cable cap on the other one on the negative, I'm reducing my risk of getting a shock with these things touching each other as I'm doing the crimping process, which is obviously a risky situation right now. But I also removed a fuse from my fuse block on the positive side, so I'm able to reduce risk. But remember, whenever the sun's out and you're dealing with solar panels, it's effectively hot work electrically. It's all plugged in. Definitely feels a lot firmer. I'm gonna hang out for a little bit, make sure I don't have any heat buildup. I will say these are a pain in the ass to deal with. Once it's all plugged in, it's relatively firm and heavy duty, and it's just your choices are really limited when you're trying to do 50 amps, DC cable connector. I'm running about 30 amps on this. I wanted a little safety margin as far as my capacity goes. But that's the quick cable connectors. I think they're overpriced. I think they're a little too tricky to install. They don't come with instructions. They're the best on the market only because nobody has anything better that's readily available.